plenty of time, beauty. Let's now go to item 10, notice of motion from Councillor Beaven. Just before we start, we've got how it's set out there, the process of a notice of motion. So, but what I'm going to suggest is, if it's moved and seconded, I think some of us have got some questions we'd like to ask of staff, and then perhaps you can tell us why you put it up, and the seconder can. Is that acceptable, or do you?
Well, I was actually going to raise that with you, Chair, because normally what we get is a paper or a report or something, and we can ask questions and have a discussion about it, and then we move to the resolutions and have a debate.
Maybe we ask a few questions first, and then you can move and second it, and then we can continue like that.
What I was actually going to suggest was that the notice of motion gets moved and seconded, and I'd like to open the discussion with talking about why I put this notice of motion on the table, and then perhaps we can have some discussion and ask questions. I mean, I know it's a departure from normal practice, but I just think it might be helpful if I give some context to the.
I think in this instance it would be helpful. So let's do that. So you're happy to move?
Yeah.
And we have a seconder, Councillor Barker. Thank you. Wish to speak?
Okay. Thanks, Chair. This was another matter that was moved from the Regional Planning Committee agenda, and there was actually a change that we made to the notice of motion as a consequence of my discussions with Ian around the wording of the original notice of motion, with the intent that it might perhaps be easier to deliver on the changed notice of motion, and it would be less of an impediment or a constraint on staff time to carry out the research that's involved in this, and therefore deprive the tank process of less of the science that we need to spend on that. So that's the background to the notice of motion. Perhaps also by way of background, I should say that a number of both councillors and staff attended a hui in Hastings some weeks ago now, which was a very well attended hui. It was held at the end of the afternoon, one weekday, and we were delivered some pretty clear messages, I guess, from those people who attended that hui, messages of concern mostly about water. And I boiled down the messages that I got from that hui into, if you like, three key messages. Message one was that we have not properly consulted with iwi on water and how it should be managed. Message two was that there was a real sense of frustration that the Hawke's Bay Regional Council was not showing leadership on the issue of water at a time when leadership is needed. And the third message that I got from that hui was that there was some real concern at the proliferation of consents being granted for water bottling plants with no public notification or discussion on them. Water is the most precious resource that this council is responsible for, and in my view it's time that we stepped up and took some ownership of the issues around water, not ownership of the water itself, nobody owns the water, but ownership of the issues that surround water. So I want you to imagine for a moment that the New Zealand communities are in a reverse situation to what we currently have, and we're in a prolonged drought and there's insufficient water for our communities. So we go to China and we say, you've got some spare water, can we bottle it and ship it to New Zealand for our people? And imagine in response that China says, well actually all you've got to do is to apply for a resource consent for as much water as you want. Set up some bottling plants, no problem. We've got a really good port that you can ship it through, and by the way, there's no charge and there's no royalty. Now that sounds really bizarre, I know, and it's hard to imagine that China might do that, but that's what we've done. And we haven't done it once, we've done it 8 times here on the Hiratonga Plains in the last 2 or 3 years. Some of you might have seen a program on television on Sunday night about China and its actions that the government of China is taking to feed its people into the future. And they've committed to spend $3 trillion over the next few years to provide food security for the people of China. And it just seems to me, as they spend that money, and it's all got to be spent offshore, that we're a bit of a sitting duck because we've got very few protections for ourselves here in New Zealand. Another report that I read recently stated that well over 50% of the world's aquifers are in a state of serious decline. So the water under our feet is the most important body of water in our region, and we can't put it at risk. We need to buy ourselves some time to get our management of it right, and my notice of motion is intended to give us that time. So why do we need to do this? There are several reasons. Firstly, the quantity of water. No one in this organisation can tell us accurately how much water we can safely allocate from this aquifer. It might be much more than currently, or it might be much less. The published science that we're working on currently is quite old and it's not perfect. In fact, it dates from 2006. And the latest report we have, which is the Karamu Characterisation Report, suggests that the recharge rate into our aquifer is about 245 million cubic metres annually. Of that 245 million cubic metres, we've already consented 165 million, or 2/3 of it. The rule of thumb, Ian tells me, about how much water you can safely allocate from an aquifer is about 1/3. So in theory, we're already double allocated what we can safely do. But we don't have any accurate information on how much of that 165 million cubic metres is actually being used. So if you think of the water allocations in this region as an equation, on one side the amount that you've got available and on the other side the amount that we're actually using, we can't actually quantify today either side of that equation. So we're currently relying on old figures based on old modelling. We need to update the science through the tank process, and as you heard yesterday, we'll get that information sometime next year, so that we know more accurately how much water is actually available. So the other thing that we need to agree through the tank process is what are our priorities with that water, however much there is available. Is it for the future needs of the communities here on the Hiratonga Plains? Is it for environmental flows, which are probably going to have to be increased? Is it for re-establishing the wetlands, because we've destroyed 98% of them? And of course, that's an area of considerable concern to me because it affects whitebait population. Or is it for factories or for orchards? Or is it for water bottling? Can we draw up a hierarchy of priorities? Because this community needs to have that discussion, and it needs to determine what those priorities are with whatever water we have available. And as you know, Chair, that conversation needs to include Hapu and Iwi, who say they haven't been consulted at all today. So finally, the rules that manage our water in the aquifer are sadly lacking, because the water is given out on a first come first served basis, and it's given out even though we have the insufficient knowledge that I mentioned before as to how much is available or how much is currently being used. So there's one other unintended consequence that I've never heard anybody talk about of the water bottling consents that have been given to date, which are for about 4 million cubic metres of water. They would create an extra 120,000 truck movements taking containers to the water bottling plants, and another 120,000 truck movements back to the port with full containers. So 240,000 extra truck movements annually across these plains delivering water to the port, which by my calculation is about 700 extra truck movements every day of the year. And I'm not even sure if we have an infrastructure that can cope with that. So my notice of motion is intended to establish some constraints around the issuing of significant further consents for water and buy us time to give the tank process some validity to consider more accurate science, and so that we've got better information from our community on what their priorities are with the water that is available. Right. So we could have a seconder now, or with your indulgence, perhaps we could get a few questions going. Or
Very indulgent.
it's good.
I'm very indulgent.
Thank you. So questions. I have one to start, and I can see the intent of this, but my concern is, and the question to Mr. Maxwell is, does this send a shot across the bow, if you like, of the tank process, that the council's actually going to move in another direction before the full range of opportunities have been explored with everyone at the table?
What I had envisaged would come out of effectively Councillor Beaven's motion is asking us to go away and come back with some options to say if we wanted to impose some interim limits, what could we do and how could we do it? And I think we've heard a clear message that that needs to be mindful of the fact that there's a policy discussion on the go with our community at the moment, and that we wouldn't want to impact that to prevent the science being delivered for that program to successfully write policy. In terms of how the tank group might view it, I don't know. I think Gavin's down the back and he might have a view on this. In essence, you wouldn't be writing new policy. What the option might be is to assess whether it's possible and practicable to introduce further limits in areas where we don't have them, and I'm thinking particularly of the confined part of the aquifer, based on the current science and maybe a little bit of extra science that we would add to it, that we were probably going to add to the process anyway to establish the overall allocation framework for Hiratonga. So we would be doing that work and we would be developing a placeholder around how much was okay to take. Taking it beyond the point of that and saying and reprioritising the use, I don't know whether that's possible, and that would certainly potentially conflict with the tank process, because that's what the tank process is intended to do, is have those discussions around what is okay and what is not. I saw this simply being largely a body of science to say what could a limit be, or what are the options for limits, and how would we go about it, how long would it take and how much would it cost, effectively. That's the report we would bring back.
Okay, so let's go around the table. Councillor Dick Scott.
Yeah, well, Mr. Chairman, I've got a little bit of a problem with this process. I know it's being done in accordance with standing orders, and the rewording makes it more acceptable. But I've been used to rules surrounding notices of motion, whereby if a notice of motion went to council or a committee, and if it was adopted on the basis that it was sent off to the appropriate committee for consideration with a officer's report to be considered. So I guess effectively that's going to happen in the sense of a report back to the options by the end of August, although I wonder whether that timing's a bit tight. My other question is, Councillor Beaven has said we don't know what we're actually using. Now, we've got a process of metering. How complete is the water metering installation process, and to what extent do we know or don't know what is actually being abstracted?
Our rollout of water meters as per the regulations is on track and on target. So the larger takes, the over 20 litre a second takes are now metered. We're in the 10 to 20s are in now. The 10 to 20s are in now, and we're now dealing with the less than 5. So we've got a large number of, or the majority of users under metering now, and we have a good idea of how much is being used. Not all of them are metered, some of the smaller ones aren't, but we've got a good indication.
So you're getting to the point where you can reasonably accurately know what actually is being taken.
Correct.
And just another part of that question which interests me is the end of August a realistic time for you to come back with some options without burdening your work program too much?
Well, yeah, like I say, in essence, what I'm envisaging bringing back is simply some options to say, well, if you want to deal with this interim limit setting process, here are some options you could consider. Here are the costs and the time associated with them.
Other questions? Councillor Scott.
My concerns are around the impact this has on existing science programs and existing work programs around the tank process. So I want to know that we're not actually biting off at this stage a unnecessary chunk of work, which will actually slow the process that is needed on tank. The concerns of the tank group have been very much, and I'm sorry, I don't want to speak to this, but I really want to get some feeling around the impact on it. The concerns of the tank group have been that the progress on the science to inform them around that water model, and we've heard a lot from where that process is at and why it's slowed down, but they don't want to see anything else that's going to slow that. So can you do anything around this that is not going to slow the tank process and frustrate that even further?
So, very good question, and we haven't turned our mind to it in detail. That's exactly what we would bring back in August, to say, well, these are the options, here are the resources required, and I would be expecting to see in that report an explanation as to whether that's going to impede our existing programs, i.e. are we taking existing resource to do this, and therefore the program of work we were doing is stopped or delayed, or are we resourcing this over and above? So it would explore all those options and present them back to you.
So it sounds like this is a sensible step. Any other questions? Mr. Moore?
Well, I agree with what Councillor Dick was saying, but if indeed this went to a vote, I think that would be against the spirit of the what's it called? Motion. Sorry. I had an hour or so with Ian in his office to some questions about the water bottling thing, and I came away from there an hour wiser. And he said, look, let's get a half a dozen of the tangata whenua together in the office and go through the same sort of thing so we understand the whole process better. I would be annoyed if we just went to a vote, as I said, because I don't think this is about a vote. This is about better understanding. And if we all came together for a couple of hours in a workshop and just went through this and then went to that position, because this is really important and it's very complex at the same time.
Well, we've teased out a few questions there. I'm just wondering whether we perhaps hear from the seconder and then any other speakers and go back to the mover and see where we go.
Thank you very much for that, Chair. I firstly want to congratulate Councillor Beaven for his notice of motion. It shows a great deal of thought and consideration and being alert to the growing public concern around water. One of the functions of the Regional Council is to provide leadership, and leadership can be expressed in both ways, of being well out in front and expecting people to be followed, or leadership can be in the terms of Woodrow Wilson, which was, where are my people going? I need to know before I wish to lead them. Now, I think on this particular issue, this water has generated a lot of public concern, and they're uncertain about what's happening here. The numbers, when you read the numbers of the water amount being taken, the millions of litres, people feel these are astronomical figures. Whether they are or not is immaterial. That's the public perception. And the public perception is that this has got out of control. Whether it has or not is immaterial. Perception is reality in these things. And this council has a responsibility to ensure that it takes its public with it. And I think this process here is as much about the notice of motion by Councillor Beaven is as much about the issues raised by Councillor Mohi, when he said we need to have a talk, we never think about it, and make sure everybody understands what's going on here. And I think that's the elegance of this. It's not making a decision per se, it's saying we need to understand better, we need to have more information, and need to be able to give the public surety that we know what we are doing. At the moment, people's perception is that it's almost like the Klondike.
You zoom out, put on the ground a marker saying I've got access to a water consent. There's no concession around it. It's simply given and the water's trucked away. Well, that's not exactly the case, but that's the perception people have. We have had droughts here. There's been shortages of water. People are concerned about that. Whether they're connected or not doesn't matter. It's the public perception. And I think what Councillor Beaven has suggested gives us time to develop a process whereby we can have better clarity about the issues, better clarity about the science, and give us the opportunity to take the public with us on this. I think it's an excellent way forward. It won't be perfect. Nothing in these things ever is. But in terms of addressing that underlying deep public concern about the amount of water that's being issued for bottling consents to go out of this region, when we appear in some cases to have a water shortage, is a real genuine issue, and we need to carry people with us, and I'm very happy to support Councillor Beaven's motion.
Thank you. Other speakers? Councillor Graham.
Councillor Barker's said it all, really, but I thought Councillor Bevan's elegant was the word that Councillor Barker used, and I thought that his presentation was very elegant. I realised, and very in-depth, I realised that his notice of motion has been watered down after conversations with staff, and after all, he's just asking, the report is just asking that staff investigate options. So I disagree with Mr. Mohi. I think we should vote on this. I think that it shows public that we are thinking about this issue, because I am, bring it down to a practical level, sick and tired of being accosted in the street saying, what are you guys doing about this? The public perception is that we are doing nothing, that this is just happening out of our control, and we have no process of control at all. That may be right or wrong, but actually it's incredibly loose. Whatever it is, you can just get a water consent. We are, as Councillor Beaven said, we are selling it to overseas investors, and it's going off, our water is going offshore. I understand the arguments about not picking winners, whether the water goes offshore in an apple or whether it goes offshore in a plastic bottle is not something that we can really make a judgment on, even though I would like to. So I do support this. I think it's a really good compromise of getting this issue on the table and getting our staff thinking and putting wrapping their brains around it for a solution.
Other speakers? Councillor Scott.
Mr. Chairman, I have struggled a little bit with this notice of motion. I am pleased that it has come back in a form that is perhaps more pragmatic. I will actually support the notice of motion in that I think it's a very good opportunity perhaps for the staff to be able to inform councillors as much as being able to inform the public, because I think there is a tremendous amount of misunderstanding about this resource and its various environmental impacts, whether it's taken within a unconfined or within a confined aquifer. So increasing understanding for councillors is always a really important part of the process. So for that end, I would support it. But I am concerned that we don't at this stage do anything. We are in a process. We're in a consultative process. We're in a fully committed process with a range of stakeholders across all public interests. And to slow that or to try and preempt that in any way would be wrong. So I hope that we can actually look at, well, what is the impact going to be on other science, delivery of other science programs, which are our priority in getting answers on this. There has been considerable consultation, with public, has been consultation with iwi. I go right back to the development of the water strategy, which was again a full process with input from all iwi interests. I'd look at the tank process where they're fully involved, and of course we've got the Joint Planning Committee, and no decisions on planning matters can go without full support, or at least 80% support of that committee and our iwi partners within the RPC. So I really do have worries about what can be expected out of this, because there are still people out there who would like some more water for irrigation, and we may actually most impact, any interim decisions we take could most impact on the smaller takers who haven't got the money to do expensive assessments of environmental effects. So we may be hitting the very people that we are probably thinking we're going to protect. So it's a case of having your eyes open as to some of the unintended consequences of such processes. I would actually like to say that I'm disappointed to hear xenophobia enter this argument. We are only too happy to export the water in the form of an apple. So if we're really frightened of China, perhaps we better keep all our apples here on shore, especially if we're really worried about the impact of the truck movements across to the port. We shouldn't be sending the apples.
Other speakers, Councillor Pipe.
This notice of motion was really sparked by the public's concern about the water bottling, and it's been said before about the similarities between exporting water with apples and with a plastic in a plastic bottle. I'm not going to go into that, but what I'm going to say is I would support this with this motion, because for one thing, I'm trying to get as much information as possible myself and try to come up to speed with this. Yesterday we had a very informative field trip where we were looking at what we could see on the Heratonga Plains of the water usage. What we couldn't see was what was under the ground, and that science is the thing that's being developed at the present time. So we know we're getting a greater grip on how much water we're extracting from the aquifer, but we don't quite know what's down there. And I think that's the concern that most people have. Are we taking too much or whatever? To actually pick on one particular area of extraction of water, I think is wrong, but I think we need to have more information, and this most probably will give us a little bit more information. And I'm also supporting it because I believe that this is going to feed into the tank process. So this information that we get, that we learn more, that the public learns more, that members of the planning committee, the Māori representatives around the table will learn more from this as well. I think that's really important. So I'll support that as a way of learning more and getting that information flow to the people, to the community, and through the tank process.
I think we've heard enough in favour. Anyone against?
Ask for a point of clarification, and there was some discussion about recommendation number 2, and was August too tight a time frame?
He said it wasn't.
Yeah, happy with it. Sorry.
Yeah. Sum up in two sentences or less. Actually, you do have more time than that.
Thank you, Chair.
The coffee's going cold, I might add, but I think you're there, Councillor. I think you're there, Councillor. Is the message I'm sending you.
I will be brief, and I just want to. Some councillors have quite understandably raised concerns around the possibility that this will either derail the tank process or take staff away from the tank process. I want to give them assurances that's actually not the case at all. In fact, it's the opposite. During my discussions with Ian, I've been at some pains to ensure that the tank process maintains its validity, if you like, and that this arguably will actually add to the tank process rather than detract from it. So in that sense, I think I can offer some assurances to staff, and I also did discuss with Ian how long he would need to come back with some further information for us to consider, and it was he that nominated August as a date for that rather than me. So perhaps just one other comment from me, Chair, and I don't like a description of xenophobia, but I will talk very briefly about the use of water for bottling as opposed to the apple industry. So The current consents for water bottling are about 4 million cubic metres. The current consents for orchards on the Hiratonga Plains, apple and pear orchards, is about 8 million cubic metres of water, so about twice the amount of water. The jobs that are created in our orchards by those 8 million cubic metres of water are approximately 1,200 full-time jobs and about 9,000 seasonal jobs, and the number of jobs that are going to be created by half of that amount of water, the 4 million cubic metres that have been issued to date for water bottling, will create about 100 jobs. So I ask you, which allocation of water is more important to this community and its economic welfare? So I'll leave it at that, Chair.
All those in favour? Aye. And against? Carried. Right, let's